Good morning, good evening, good night, wherever you are in the world. I am so excited to be joining you for day 3 of Total Ties. So welcome. We are here for an amazing keynote speaker to get us started for day 3. My name is Jerry and I am thrilled to be your moderator this afternoon, this evening, or good morning. So we are here for Annie. Annie, you are going to be leading us down a wonderful journey around the extended mind, embracing the limitless by thinking outside of the brain. So I cannot wait for this session. Our chat has already exploded with all the many friends who know the drill of sharing where they are in the world. We have at least 4 continents that I've seen already, Annie. We have Laurie in Nanjing. We have Monique joining us from Rio de Janeiro. We have, oh my goodness, Virginia. So we have Janet joining us. It's wonderful to see all these many friends from all over the world joining us. Annie, I'm super excited to get us started. So thank you everyone for joining us. As we wait for a few more friends to jump online, I am just going to share a little bit of information about Annie if you're not familiar with her body of work. She is an acclaimed science writer whose work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the Scientific American, and the Best American Science Writing, among many other publications. Her latest book is The Extended Mind, The Power of Thinking Outside of the Brain. And that was published just in June in 2021. So we are super excited to be able to hear more about this amazing new book from Annie. It was selected as Amazon Editor's Pick for Best Nonfiction and an Editor's Choice by the New York Times Book Review. So we are super excited. This is just one of many books that Annie has published. And if you haven't seen her TED Talk, 2.6 million people already have. So I do encourage you to go and jump in and have a watch of Annie's TED Talk as well. But you don't need to do that right now. We are about to jump into a live session with Annie. So we are super excited. Can I have the next slide, please, Annie? Thank you. Most of you are clearly very experienced at being here at a TIES event, so you know the housekeeping drill very well, I am sure. You have found your chat and you know where you can post your comments or questions. As we go through this keynote, please do be active in the chat. Please feel free to share any questions that you have. We will be making time for this towards the end of our session today, so please do, if you have any curious things that you'd like to ask Annie, please do make sure you share. For those of you who are joining us from YouTube, please feel free to drop your questions there too. We will always keep you involved in the conversation as well. Just for everyone's awareness, this webinar has been developed independently from and is not endorsed by the IB. Next slide, please. Thanks. Awesome. So, as you are also probably very familiar now, Toddle is an amazing organization that not only does these amazing community events like what you're attending right now, but it is a platform that helps teachers with all facets of the learning journey through the communication with parents, all of the pieces of the in-class learning with their students, and certainly the ways that we engage as a community around the school. So Toddle is your partner in crime if you are looking for someone to help you with any aspect of your learning journey. So thank you so much, Annie. Would you like to move to the next slide? It's time to get social, everyone. As we go through our keynote today, please be social. Please join us on any of your chosen social media platforms using the Total Ties hashtag. We would love to hear the curious things that you are thinking about and sharing with the global community who may not be here at the event today. Annie, with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, and I'm so excited to hear what you're sharing with us today.
Thank you so much, Sherry. I love your enthusiasm. That's a great way to start off our talk today. So I'll advance the slide one more time, or first of many times. And just give you a little bit more background on myself before I get started. As Jerry said, I'm a science writer. I have always written about the science of human beings, of human nature, of psychology. I'm particularly interested in cognitive science, in how humans learn and think. And my book, The Extended Mind, which came out in June of this year, started out as a book about the science of learning. I have 2 children, and ever since they were born, and especially since they started school, I've been really interested in how they learn, how their teachers teach them. And I feel fortunate that I was able to pair that with my own professional interests, because the science of learning is such a exciting and dynamic field. I've been able to not only observe my own children, but to learn about what's going on in their minds and what's going on in their classrooms from a research point of view as well. So for a number of years now, I've been focusing on my reporting and my research on the science of learning. And that's what led me to the extended mind. I think we'll get into how that happened as we go. The extended mind may not. Oh, I'm so sorry. That's my cat scratching on the cat condo that holds up my computer. So apologies for that. The extended mind may not be an idea that you've encountered before. I think it's very relevant to education and to learning. In a nutshell, it contends that we don't just think with our heads, we think with all kinds of mental extensions, and we'll get into what those are in this talk. But perhaps I'll start with what the extended mind as an idea is pushing back against. In terms of what limits students' learning, there's a paradigm out there, there's a model out there of thinking and learning that we can call the brain-bound model. This is the idea that thinking and learning does happen inside the head, that it's limited to the brain. And there are a couple of metaphors we use to understand the mind that really reinforce this brain-bound model. One is the brain is like a computer. You know, this is a metaphor that really got its start in the cognitive revolution of the last century, when human beings invented computers, and then in a funny turnaround sort of likened our own brains to this thing that we had created. And at this point, in 2022, the idea that a brain is like a computer pervades our way of speaking, our way of thinking, our way of arranging education, and so much so that we may not even be aware of it. But we tend to think of our brains as information processing machines, like computers. And I hope to show, and I think the extended mind illuminates how actually the well springs of human intelligence are very, very different from those of computer intelligence. Our intelligence springs from our bodies, the fact that we are embedded in environments, the fact that we are connected to other people. These things are what make human intelligence so special and so different, and in many ways so much better than computer intelligence. So I urge us not to think of the human brain as sort of a second-rate computer that can't quite manage the feats that computers manage, but rather something entirely different and in many ways far superior. So the other metaphor that really dominates the way that we think about the brain and the mind is the brain is like a muscle. And I'm sure many of you have encountered the growth mindset, which is an idea introduced by psychologist Carol Dweck. And that holds that, as I say, the brain is like a muscle, that the way the brain gets stronger is by exercising it like a physical muscle, that this is the way that we get stronger. And this is a very empowering message, I know, for a lot of teachers and a lot of students. And I'm certainly a huge admirer of Dr. Dweck. But I do think that it can be, in practice, it can be somewhat limiting in the sense that it focuses us on the brain. It's a brain-centric kind of approach. And many a student, and I certainly have seen this with my own kids, can get stuck in that sort of, I just need to sit here and work my brain until I get this done. And that can be very frustrating. What I love about the extended mind is that it opens up the world. It offers us and our students so many more options, so many more avenues to bring in extraneural, meaning outside the brain, resources into the process of learning and thinking. So as I say, it opens up the world opens up our students' minds to the world and all the things that are in our worlds that can help them think, and doesn't lead them to think that that their brains are their only resource. So advance here. So an alternative to the brain-bound model is the extended mind. And so in place of these metaphors, these very common metaphors that I've been telling you about, I'd like to propose a new metaphor, a different metaphor, which is the brain as orchestra conductor. So the brain is still at the center of things. I don't ever want to lead anyone to think that I'm not saying that the brain is not at the center of thinking. It is, but the brain doesn't have to do it all by itself. It can be sort of the orchestra conductor, the clearinghouse in a sense, but it doesn't have to do it all by itself. It can be drawing in other resources to augment its own limited biological resources. And that allows the brain to sort of overachieve. So, I am a science writer, and I enjoy lots of presentations and books and programs by my fellow science writers. I do notice that whenever science writers talk about the brain, they tend to take a very particular kind of, they enter a particular kind of mode. The brain is so amazing, it's so extraordinary, it's so incredible, it's the most complex object in the universe, and I think that, and it is all those things, but it is also a limited, quirky, idiosyncratic biological organ that evolved to do things that are quite different from what we ask ourselves, what we ask it to do, what our students ask it to do in our current world, in our modern world. And sometimes I think that all this emphasis on how amazing and extraordinary the brain is can lead us to feel like, well, did I get a bum one? Did I get one? Because I forget things and my attention gets distracted, and I sometimes have trouble figuring something out or coming up with a solution. And I find it very reassuring. And this is a notion that's sort of built into the idea of the extended mind, that actually the brain is limited. It's, as I say, it's shaped by evolution to do a certain limited number of things, not so much the kind of things we ask it to do today, like deal with abstract concepts and interact with abstract symbols. All these things are kind of difficult for the brain to do. And this is why we do see so many problems with memory and attention and motivation and learning and understanding. There's a gap between what the biological brain evolved to do and what we ask of it. And it's the extended mind, the resources of the extended mind, that can kind of fill in the gap and allow us to transcend the limits of the biological brain. And I want to add here that this is not a matter of individual differences, who's smarter, who's more smart, who's less smart. The human brain is limited in this way for all of us. These are universal limitations. And so we all face this challenge. And I believe that the extended mind is the answer. So as I've been saying, the extended mind, the theory of the extended mind, holds that we don't have to think with our brains alone. We can think with mental extensions that allow us to reach outside the brain, draw in these outside the brain resources to augment the biological brain's limited capacities. And there are four major categories, classes of mental extensions. One of them, the first of these, is our tools and our devices. And most of us have our smartphones within easy reach most of the time. I certainly do. And I think thinking about mental extension in terms of our devices is one of the easiest way into this somewhat, perhaps, esoteric idea of the extended mind, because we can see ourselves offloading or extending our minds with our devices every day. I am old enough to remember a time when you had to actually remember phone numbers. You had to remember your mom's office number or your best friend's phone number. These days, nobody remembers phone numbers, or at least I don't anymore, because they're stored in our phones. Our phones remember our phone numbers of note for us. So this is a really clear example of how we are offloading a mental function that used to be taken care of by the brain And we're allowing our device to do that for us. And we're extending our minds by allowing a mental function to be carried on by some resource outside the brain. And the positive side of this is that relieves our brain of some bit of bandwidth that used to be devoted to remembering XYZ phone numbers or whatever, and frees up mental bandwidth for us to apply to other things, hopefully higher things, the higher cognitive functions of imagining and planning and problem solving and idea generation. That would be the upside of offloading some of these routine or mundane mental functions to our devices, tools and devices. So, but our tools and devices are not the only mental extensions that we can use. The others are a little bit less, perhaps a little bit less intuitive, but I think quite interesting. Another mental extension is actually our body, the body below the neck. So, our culture tends to separate mind and body and to assume that body has nothing to contribute to intelligent thinking. And research in what's known as embodied cognition shows that this is totally false, that actually the body, its sensations, its gestures, its movements are all intimately intertwined with the processes of thinking and learning. So we can, with some skill and some intention and some learning, we can learn how to use the body more effectively to enhance our thinking. The third category of mental extensions is our physical surroundings. Now, this is where the sort of metaphor of brain as computer really falls down, where we really see its limitations, because this computer that I'm speaking to you on right now, this laptop, it operates exactly the same way here in my home office. It would operate the same way if I took it outside, if I took it on a trip. Its function is not affected by where it is, but the human brain is quite different. It's exquisitely sensitive to context, and that context could be the context of our body, how we're feeling how our body is feeling that day. It could be whether we're inside or outdoors. It could be the social context, like who's around us. All these things really affect the way we think, how well we're able to think. So that this, here I'm talking about a body of research known as situated cognition, the idea that where we are affects how we think. And then finally, the fourth and final category of mental extension that I want to talk about is our relationships, our social interactions with other people. And what I'm talking about here is a body of research known as socially distributed cognition. And that refers to the fact that we don't really think as individuals, we think with other people. Human beings are such fundamentally social creatures that all of our thinking, even when we're by ourselves, is in a sense social, because psychologists believe that actually even our thought processes is a kind of internalized conversation, and how did we learn language in the first place? It was in the context of other people. So again, our culture, just as our culture tends to separate mind and body, we also tend to separate social life from intellectual and academic life, as if they're separate and maybe even opposed. We think it's okay for kids to chatter and talk on the playground or in the school lunchroom, but when they come back into class, too often this happens, not all the time, but too often when we expect them when they come back into class to be quiet and sit still and not talk to their neighbor, but in fact, human beings have these powerful social brains that are on all the time. It's not like they're only on when we're in an expressly social situation. So then the challenge becomes, how do we leverage and harness those powerful social brains in the service of learning? So it's my contention, and I hope I can persuade you of this, that it's time to extend the mind. And the reason I say that is the case is because our world is so demanding of our mental resources. There's so much information coming at us all the time. The expertise that we have to master is so specialized, and frankly, the problems we face are so daunting that we really need to go beyond what the biological brain is capable of and extend the mind in order to meet the moment. And the good news is that we are already extending our minds. Human beings are just primed to extend their minds. We naturally gesture. We draw on gut feelings, known as interoception. I'll get to that in a moment. We arrange our learning and workspaces in particular ways. Of course, we run ideas by other people and engage in debate and conversation. But I believe that we tend to do these things in a rather haphazard and unintentional way. We don't do it with a lot of deliberation or consciousness or intention, because our education systems have been so focused on cultivating the brain, on the particular, teaching to the brain and its capacities, that we haven't really offered our students an education in, say, using gesture and movement to enhance thinking, or deliberately shaping their environments in order to support intelligent thought, or thinking in groups and not just as individuals. Again, we live in such an individualistic culture where we have a focus on individual achievement and individual assessment. So it's my contention that we actually need to have something like a second education, not just an education of the brain, but an education of all the resources outside the brain that we could be bringing into our thinking processes. So onward. I don't want to go too far over our time. So I may be, and I don't want to be bombarding you with too much information. So I may not mention every facet on these slides. I'm happy to share these slides with anyone who would like to read them later, but I may just be giving you the highlights here because there's a lot. So I'll start here with the idea of interoception, which is a wonky kind of technical term that I wasn't familiar with when I started researching and reporting this book, but I think all of us know under the rubric of gut feelings or gut intuition, this idea that the body seems to sometimes know things that the conscious mind doesn't. And it was really interesting to me as a science writer to learn how it is that these gut intuitions, gut feelings arise. And this is how. So as we go through our everyday lives, we're taking in so much information. We're noticing patterns. We're taking note of patterns and regularities in our experience. But all of this is far too much for our conscious minds to store and to process and store. But we are processing it and storing it on a non-conscious level, because our conscious minds are actually just a really small fraction of the whole. And then the question becomes, well, if all this knowledge and wisdom and experience is stored non-consciously, how do I access it? And the answer is the body. When you feel that quickening of your heartbeat, or a tightening in your chest, or a butterfly sort of start up in your stomach, that's your body kind of tapping you on the shoulder and or tugging you on the sleeve and saying, you're encountering a situation now that you've encountered in the past, and the body is preparing you to deal with that challenge or that task. And the problem in our society is that we, again, because we tend to separate mind and body, elevate mind over body as if the body is dumb and irrational and has nothing to contribute to intelligent thought and learning. We tend to suppress the body's signals. We tend to ignore them. We tend to maybe even deliberately kind of quash them in order to get our work done. This idea that we just need to sort of power through and ignore the body's signals, when really what we need to be doing is turning inward occasionally on a periodic basis and checking in with ourselves, seeing what's there to learn from what the body has to tell us. And that capacity is known as interoception. And we can cultivate the capacity, our interoceptive capacity, our interoceptive attunement, through practices like the body scan, which, if you are familiar with meditation or mindfulness practice, you may have encountered already. It often starts off a meditation or mindfulness session. And a body scan involves bringing non-judgmental, curious, open-minded attention to whatever feelings are arising in your body. And this doesn't have to be a formal practice. It doesn't have to be done while sitting on a meditation cushion. It can be something that you try to do a couple times a day in an informal way. And I find that we are so bombarded by external stimuli in our very noisy world. You know, there's so much coming at us all the time from the external world that we can almost forget that we have this internal world as well, with these internal signals and cues that are quieter and subtler, but always there, you know, and always there to be experienced when we take that time to check in with ourselves. And that's something that we can teach our students to do as well, because increased interoceptive sensitivity is associated with better control over your emotions, because you're more aware of what you're feeling, with greater empathy, and with just an increased ability to regulate yourself and your relationships with other people. So perhaps we'll want to introduce this funny word, interoception, into our classrooms and teach our kids about how important it is to not only be paying attention to the outside world, but also to their internal world. So next, I'm going to talk about how important movement is. You know, again, I'm going to talk a lot today about the importance of remembering our evolutionary history, because again, we often imagine our brains as computers cut off from any kind of human history. But in fact, you know, we have these Stone Age brains in this modern world. Our physical equipment hasn't changed really substantively in many thousands of years. And human beings didn't really evolve to stay still. We evolved to move, and we evolved to think while moving. If you think about activities like hunting and foraging, these are activities that are cognitively demanding and physically demanding at the same time. And these are the kinds of activities that shaped the development of human intelligence. So again, we tend to, because we separate mind and body, we tend to separate physical movement from intellectual and academic activity. We have kids run around on the playground, but then we have them be still and quiet in the classroom. What I'm suggesting is that we need to bring movement into the classroom as much as possible. That can be these micro movements, like allowing kids to stand instead of sit, or to bounce on an exercise ball, or even to sit on the floor, or just allow them a sort of greater freedom of movement, so they're not using up mental bandwidth, just inhibiting that natural urge to move. And, you know, interestingly, research shows that a bout of brisk physical activity just before we engage in cognitive activity really sharpens our ability to think and understand and remember. So this is one reason I'm a big fan of recess. It's a great way to incorporate physical movement into the day, and prime students for really the best thinking that they're capable of. So I'll go on to talk about gesture. Gesture is something that, if we think about at all, we tend to think about in terms of communication with other people. But what's so interesting about the research on gesture is that it shows that it's actually part of our own thinking process, that when people are inhibited from gesturing, they think less cogently, they speak less fluidly, they're less able to explain complex concepts or come up with new ideas. And so we want to be encouraging our students to gesture as much as possible, to give them license to move their hands around, maybe even encourage them by saying something like, when you're explaining that, you know, move your hands as you say that. And another tip for eliciting gesture is that people tend to gesture more when they have something to gesture at. So when we can provide visual artifacts, material artifacts for our students to point at, to sort of use their hands around, that can be a really good way to to elicit gesture. And we want to do that as much as possible because gesture actually helps prime our thoughts and deepen our understanding. So it's not just about communicating with other people, it's actually about optimizing our own thought processes. So moving on in our speed tour of the extended mind, Jerry, can I ask you, how much time do I have left here?
We are at 6:30, so our hard stop is 6:45. So we have 15 minutes total. So please, everyone is loving what you're sharing. So please don't worry about it.
Okay. So we're on the second of the two major extensions that I want to talk about. Now we're moving into space, physical space, and how that can affect the way that we think. One of the most productive and generative kinds of spaces to think in is the outdoors. And again, I'm going to speak again about our evolutionary history. You know, human beings evolved in the outdoors. This world where we live, where we're inside almost all the time, is evolutionarily speaking a very recent development. And because we evolved in the outdoors, our perceptual faculties are really tuned to the kind of information, the kind of stimuli that we encounter when we're outside. It's very easy for our brains to process the sight of a tree or clouds or waves or grass. You know, it's much more draining for the brain to focus on a screen or a piece of paper, for that matter, for hours at a time, because those little squiggles, learning to read is an acquired ability for human beings, whereas there's so many natural abilities that require no instruction, and one of those is taking in the outdoors. So what that means is that when we're outside, all the demands on our attention are really kind of reversed. We're refilling the tank of our attentional capacity, so that after we've spent some time outside, after our students have spent some time outside, we can they can return to the classroom sort of more with their attention refreshed and restored. And if we're not able to get outside, if we're not always able to take that break in the outdoors, even a micro restorative break of looking out the window, just even for 40 seconds, research suggests can have some of those benefits in terms of restoring our attention. So, but we do, of course, spend lots of time inside and inside our classrooms. And so it's important to think about whether our classrooms are supporting students' ability to engage in intelligent and creative thought. And a few thoughts here. Psychologists like to talk about evocative objects, that is, objects and symbols and cues that we can surround our students with, that we can put on our walls in our classrooms, that have meaning for students, and that affirm their identity and their sense of belonging. Those are kind of two of the especially important things that signs and symbols in our environment can do. They can remind us or remind our students of who they are and what their identity is and what they're doing in that particular place. You know, their identity as scholars and thinkers and creators. And they can also remind our students that they belong to a meaningful group. And so we want to think in terms of, are the things that our students are seeing in their classrooms, are they giving them a sense of belonging? Is it possible that they're feeling a sense of exclusion and that this isn't a place where people like them belong? So that's a kind of lens through which we can look at our classroom spaces. It's also important, research finds, for people to have a sense of ownership and control over their space. So as much as possible, and it's difficult, of course, in a classroom shared by many students, but as much as possible, if students can be granted a sort of a way to personalize their space, to make it feel as if it's theirs, we're much more comfortable and much more productive in spaces that we feel that we own and we have control over. So this last piece of the space section is about what I call the space of ideas. So We tend to think as a culture that smart people, geniuses do it in their heads, and I always find it very interesting that we think it's fine for very young children, kindergartners, to use manipulatives, say to learn math or to do things with their hands. But we think that we should put those aside, as we get older, and it's a mark of mature intelligence to do things in your head. But in fact, it continues, even for us adults, to be the most efficient and effective way to think, to actually, as much as possible, get those ideas and pieces of information outside of your head, spread them out onto physical space, whether that's a big whiteboard or bulletin board, whether that's a bunch of Post-it notes that you can move around, whether that's a multi-monitor setup where you have several monitors instead of just one. And what that does, it has several benefits, this process known as cognitive offloading. One is that it simply relieves us of the burden of remembering whatever it is that we're thinking about. When we put that down on paper, we put down the burden of having to remember all those disparate pieces of information. And then again, we have greater mental bandwidth for the higher cognitive activities of planning and imagining and problem solving. It also puts some distance between us and our ideas, which allows us to see the ideas and information in a new way. And once we have it spread out in physical space, we can bring all these embodied resources to the interaction with that information. Like, as I've been saying, the human brain didn't really evolve to do this kind of symbolic, abstract thinking. It evolved to do things like manipulate physical objects and move the body through space and navigate through three-dimensional landscapes. So the more we can turn information into objects that we can move around, like Post-it notes, or three-dimensional landscapes that we can move our bodies along, to the right and to the left and in closer and back out, that allows us to use this suite of embodied resources that are really our human birthright, like our spatial memory. For example, we can remember that this is over here and this is over there. These are all, these embodied resources are all dormant. They lay dormant when we keep all that information in our head. So we want to model for our students and encourage them to offload what's in their head as much as possible onto physical space. So onward to the last mental extension, which is other people. Again, I spoke earlier about how we tend to separate social life from mental and academic life, and how misguided I think this is. We actually want to, as I said, try to harness the social brain as much as possible in the service of learning. And one way we can do that is to bring social activities into the classroom. And of course, many teachers do this already, but the more we can bring social activities like storytelling, like teaching each other, peer-to-peer teaching, and debating and arguing with each other, these social activities, again, they initiate cognitive processes that remain dormant when we are just sitting and thinking by ourselves. I'll say a word here in particular about storytelling, that stories are, psychologists like to say that they are psychologically privileged. We seem to listen to them more attentively, understand them more thoroughly, remember them more accurately than information that's presented in any other way. So I think there's lots of opportunities to present information in a story form. And whenever we can do that, we should give that a try. So I want to talk here for a minute about the group mind, which has a bit of a bad reputation. I think that can make us think of groupthink and sort of unthinking, following a leader. But I'm talking about something different here. What I'm talking about is a group of people combining the resources of their individual minds into something that's more intelligent than the whole is more intelligent than the parts. And this is a challenge for us because we are such an individualistic culture. Our habits of thinking and learning are often very individualistic, and we need to find ways to think as a group. And a couple of suggestions I have here are emphasizing to students that when they're thinking with a group, they're thinking with other people, they need to leave traces of their thinking. You know, when we're in our own minds, that's not necessary, but when we're thinking with other people, we really need to, and this is another example of when cognitive offloading is a good idea. One reason is not just for our own thinking processes, but also to make our thinking processes visible to other people. And I've included there also another technique from the research, which suggests that when you're having a group conversation, in order to make sure that everyone has heard and processed what others are saying, you can try this sequence of asking students to acknowledge and repeat and rephrase and elaborate on what the person before them has said. And this has a lot of benefits, including just for memory, that because it's not as if something is said and disappears into the ether, it actually gets repeated and processed and sort of put out there again for the group to think about. So, deep breath. I've come to the end here or near the end of the presentation that I wanted to make to you. I hope that I have at least begun to make a case for the extended mind. As I say, the thing that I personally love about the extended mind is that it opens up the world to students to bring the world into their thinking, and it offers them so many more choices and opportunities than simply using their own brains, which I think is too often the message we give them, that the only resource they have to use is their own brain, when really there are so many other extraneural resources available to them at any moment. I think it's helpful for students to know that the human brain is limited, that everyone's brain is limited in these ways, that if they suffer issues with motivation or memory or attention, that's just a natural outgrowth of the nature of the organ that we all have inside our heads. And that the way we can transcend those limits is the extended mind, is learning to use these outside the brain resources. And that's perhaps I've already said what my favorite thing about the extended mind is, but here's another favorite thing, which is that it's a skill. It's not an innate ability. It's not something fixed. It's something that every student can learn and cultivate and develop for themselves with our help. So there's some information about me. I'd love to hear from you, on email or on Twitter, but right now I'd love to hear questions. So I think Jerry's going to help me with that.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness, you have taken us on such a beautiful journey. You should see the chat, Annie. Everyone is absolutely adored everything you've been able to share with us today. So thank you very, very much for the adventure we've been on. I think you've touched on some of this idea very much so, but Rose has very much connected with the idea of we are social beings. And yes, she's curious about the effects that COVID is having on learning. As we have time for maybe just one quick answer to that one. Otherwise, you'll be joining us in the huddle in a few moments as well.
Yes. So a couple of thoughts on that. One is that, of course, many of us are having our interactions online as we are right now. But that there's no reason that just because we're sort of primed to see each other as heads in boxes, that we can't push our camera a little bit farther away so that our gestures are actually part of the conversation. And we can suggest that our students do the same, so that we're communicating, we're both communicating with our gestures to each other, but also engaging that helpful benefit of gesture for our own thinking. The second thing is this question of masks and whether that inhibits students' communication with each other and with teachers. And there's a wonderful op-ed that I would suggest people look up by Judith Danovich, who wrote about how actually masks, as unfortunate as they may feel sometimes, they actually can push us to be a bit more creative about how we communicate with each other in terms of gesture and body language. COVID has been a very hard time for a lot of us, for a lot of students, for a lot of teachers. I'm hoping that it can be a kind of opportunity to reimagine and re-examine our practices to see whether they're really serving us, and to make visible the importance of the mental extensions that many of us have missed out on over the past 2 years. For example, being in person with each other and having those opportunities to have face-to-face and in-person interactions. I think we all appreciate those in a way that perhaps we didn't before, because we took them for granted. And I think the among many other things, the pandemic has made visible how very central and important mental extensions are to our thinking.
Thank you so much for that thoughtful response. We are out of time in this format, my friends, but with a few notes just so that everyone is aware. If you are in the Hublio platform, we will be heading to our reflection circle. I'm hopefully most of you have worked out how to get there. I won't walk you through it now, but please do come and join us over in the rooms. You'll be able to click on the tab that says rooms, and I will be opening it just momentarily. For those of you who are online in YouTube, we do have 2 amazing masterclasses that are coming up just momentarily after we have a bit of a break. But we do have Jay McTighe or Ron Richard. I don't know how you choose between the 2. If you can clone yourself and attend both, that would be my tip. But thank you all so very much. Annie, it has been an absolute pleasure to be on this journey with you. You have affirmed so many of the things that I personally believe in my practice. So I thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. And I look forward to seeing everyone over in the reflections huddle very shortly. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Sherry. Thank you all.